wanted to talk to you about the regulatory framework in South Africa and internationally regulating violence and harassment in the world of work. We all operate in an ever-changing context, and we need to adapt to that context. And why is it that harassment is such a huge focus at the moment? We are seeing internationally a paradigm shift and activism, and in South Africa, against violence and harassment in the world of work. And why is it an issue? Because people make it an issue now and the paradigm shift, and also because the law makes it an issue. And as we are seeing a change in paradigms, we are also seeing a change in the regulatory framework. And what is important for us to know is that the International Labour Organization has issued a new convention, Convention 190, which talks about ending violence and harassment in the world of work. Now, this convention has the impact that if countries ratify it, that our legislation and our secondary legislation, such as the codes of good practice, would need to adapt to that. So where are we in South Africa? The Commission of Employment Equity, whose job it is to recommend legislative changes to the Minister of Labour, is currently looking at our 2005 Code of Managing Sexual Harassment and adapting it to be broader in terms of the ILo Convention. Harassment, of course, as I started saying, is contextually driven, and it's driven in the world of work and the broader society. And very importantly for us is we've always had the ILo Convention number 111 prohibiting discrimination in the world of work. The new concept, the new convention concerning violence and harassment in the world of work is much broader, and it talks about violence and harassment as a single concept, and it is a continuum of unacceptable behaviors. And this convention talks about the prevention and protection and rehabilitation. So if we look at what is in South Africa, employers have a duty in terms of Section 60 of the Employment Equity Act, and those duties are proactive and reactive. But what we are seeing is that sexual harassment and harassment in its broadest form includes a far bigger range than what we normally think of sexual harassment, male on female. And there is a whole movement to start looking at harassment, including sexism, in that it is sexist, demeaning behaviors against women and people who do not conform to gender norms. So sexualized behavior is often a tool of harassment. And we are seeing that this broader approach that the ILO is taking is already reflected in South African legislation and codes, but the ILO code convention specifically talks about a far broader perspective in the forms of harassment and who it covers. Now, when we talk about harassment, we typically think about sexual harassment, which is very, very topical at the moment. But this particular convention would have the effect that our code has to be broader to include sexual harassment, workplace bullying, racial harassment, harassment related to gender, and harassment related to family and family responsibility and pregnancy. So from a South African perspective, we often have to remember that harassment in the first place is regulated by our Constitution and the Bill of Rights in Chapter 2 and Section 9 of the Constitution, common law, and the Employment Equity Act and Section 60, as I've mentioned, of the Employment Equity Act. And then there are two codes, and we often forget about the code. We know that the Commission has withdrawn the 1998 code, so South Africa has the code 2005 of handling sexual harassment, as well as the 2005 code of human resources practices dealing with that. We have sources of law not specifically providing for harassment directly, but then we have directed. I think what is important for us to note at the moment is that we have very different definitions of sexual harassment. So we've got different laws giving us different definitions. And this is one of the aspects to look at. The Employment Equity Act Code 2005 gives us a definition, and the other code gives another definition. PEPUDA, as well as the Protection Against Harassment Act, all gives us different definitions, and that very often is different in also determining what is the test to be used. So what we are looking at in the Commission is also helping to define the different forms of harassment, what the tests are. Is it a subjective test? Is it an objective test? Or is it the reasonable victim test? And these are the aspects that we need to look at. And I think it is an opportunity at this particular point in time for us as a country to look at integrating our different forms of legislation and refining it, and that we have far more guidance in terms of the interpretation and understanding of harassment. A last point that I would like to make is, if we look at our law thus far and what has happened in particular to sexual discrimination referrals to the CCMA, it is interesting to note that the CCMA tells us that between 2015 and 2018, 77% of referrals roughly are to the CCMA come from women, but there is 23% of them coming to men as well. And it's interesting that we always think male on female, but we have to understand that gender non-conforming and men in particular also report 18% of experiences of harassment in the workplace. When we look at how we resolve it and our law in addressing, particularly what do we do when a case has been prevented, it is interesting that the vast majority of cases are settled through conciliation of any sexual discrimination, and then of course quite underreported. 44, almost 45% are settled in arbitration. An interesting point of the convention in South Africa at the moment, we say that employers have to do everything practicable to prevent and address sexual harassment. So having a policy is the very least you should have. But in terms of the new convention, there is a far stronger drive on compulsory training. And what we foresee is that at the very least, supporting a policy that employers should look at training employees to understand its policy, to understand its reporting mechanisms, and to be very crystal clear on what sexual harassment is, and that sexual advances and sexual harassment, or that I was just trying my luck in any form of harassment, is important. So we foresee a much broader concept of harassment in the regulatory change, and for the work to go through NEDLAC and the social partners, and also to be far more clear in the duties of employers as well as the duties of employees, and particularly the aspect of training, that we ensure that people know what is acceptable and not. So for all of us to start looking at a renormalization of legislation to support the behavior, and the behavior to apply to legislation. So regulatory compliance is a space that we all need to be very careful and looking out for. Thank you for listening.